So I'm Terry Thornton. I'm Curator of Education here at the Modern, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday Evenings at the Modern. Tuesday Evenings is a long-running presentation series, and tonight is in fact our finale for the spring 2022 season. And we are ending on a very high note with the Fort Worth-based but never tied Jeff Ferrell, whose curiosity, defiance, and wanderlust have led him to far away and nearby but often shadowed or unseen places. So I don't think that's mysterious to anybody who knows Jeff and his work, but if it is mysterious, just let it be a sign of what you're in for tonight. With a PhD in sociology from UT Austin, Dr. Jeff Ferrell is now TCU Professor Emeritus in Sociology and was for years a visiting professor of criminology at the University of Kent in the UK. He has numerous books to his name, including Crimes of Style, Tearing Down the Streets, Empire of Scrounge, Drift, Illicit Mobility and Uncertain Knowledge, and then, of course, the focus of tonight's presentation, Last Picture, created and published with Gavin Morrison and Fraser Stables of Utopia Projects. In 1998, Jeff was the recipient of the Critical Criminologist of the Year Award from the Division of Critical Criminology of the American Society of Criminology. And he is the founding and current editor of the New York University Press series Alternative Criminology, as well as one of the founding editors of Crime, Media, Culture, an international journal, and the winner of the ALPSP Charles Worth Award for Best New Journal. This, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a big night, and I promised to keep my intro brief, so I'm trying to do that. All here is mentioned to establish Jeff's credibility. I'm just kidding. As we learn about his practice and habits as a dumpster diver, with perhaps some mention of drifting or jumping trains and such. So when that all comes up, just recall the litany of credentials I read off there. Thinking about tonight's presentation, I recently watched Jeff's 2013 TED Talk at Carnegie Mellon University titled Trespassing Trash and Trains, and I just want to say I highly recommend it to anyone who finds himself wanting more insight into Jeff Ferrell and his approach to sociology, criminology, the environment, and so much more. It's just a really good taste of exactly who he is, what he does, and a little bit of what he's about. Tonight, Jeff allows us to consider the stories of discarded pictures, the connections and lessons we find in the refuge of others' tossed memories as he presents Last Picture, Trash, Photography, Dislocation, which I have to say is going to make you really, really want the book Last Picture. So just to note, if you were unable to purchase it at the Modern store and have it signed before the lecture, there will be books available down here, or I think maybe out front afterwards, and you can still get yours signed, so rest assured. Which means we need to go ahead and get started so that we make time for everything that we have in store tonight. If you would, please join me in a warm welcome for Jeff Ferrell.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure to be here, and I especially want to thank Terry Thornton for inviting me tonight. I suspect that trash pickers aren't regularly asked to speak at the Modern, and so I know there's a certain risk in that, and I just want to assure Terry if things go badly with her career, there's always the dumpsters, so we can return to those. As Terry mentioned, I also want to make clear that this is a collaborative project, entirely so, with Gavin Morrison and Fraser Stables, who are here tonight, of Utopia Projects. These are all photos I have indeed found over the last 20 years in the trash, but the curation of these photos, the sequencing of them, both in the book and as you're seeing tonight, are the work of Gavin and Fraser, who bring to it the eye of an artist and a curator and actually a publisher as well. So I want to be sure that's clear. A starting point and a confession, I suppose. Yes, I am a lifelong dumpster diver. I've been dumpster diving, trash picking, scrounging daily now for about 45 years, so the entirety of my adult life. The reasons for this are numerous. Primarily, I have long valued my own independence and the ability to live on my own terms, and dumpster diving has allowed me to do that, to quit jobs when necessary, to find ways to survive on very little money when necessary as well, but more so I think to create my own life out of my own ingenuity and adventure as opposed to other options for creating one's life. I also see dumpster diving as an environmental intervention. Even just one old man like myself with a bicycle and occasionally my old truck hauls in tons of metal every year that otherwise would end up in the landfill and other products that are kept from the landfill. So I do see it as a kind of direct intervention in environmental waste that's produced by consumerism and other forces. And finally, I dumpster dive because I see it as a direct form of wealth redistribution and resource redistribution. Most of what I find goes to the women's shelter, the homeless shelter, the food bank, and other agencies, refugee services, other agencies that I know are in need of goods. As the gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow, I see it as my calling almost, I would say, to try to bridge that gap by taking the cast-offs of the more affluent and getting them to people who need them. So in all of this, it ends up being not only a kind of practical activity, but an engagement with various social issues, with issues of environmentalism, perhaps social justice, but also it's an engagement with human beings at the level of the trash itself. If you think about it, almost everything one finds in the trash, except for maybe a construction site, but in terms of everyday trash, has both been cast out from someone's life, but is still in many ways connected to it. So every day, every week, every month, I find a garbage bag full of baby clothes, old carpenter's tools, diplomas that have been thrown away, self-help books about alcoholism or stress or PTSD, Bibles are shockingly common in the dumpster. So in all of this, you're seeing who people have been and what mattered to them, also what has come loose from their life and ended up in the trash as well. So these are residues. These are residues that can be read carefully, not definitively, for what they tell us about other people's lives. And so again, without necessarily meaning to, I find myself, and those who know me help me in this, writing stories based on that bag of diaper or baby clothes, or why is that set of encyclopedias now in the dumpster? What happened to that kid's room that they cleared out his room of all his high school memorabilia? Off to college, we hope. Perhaps not off to jail, we'll hope off to college. So again, these items are disconnected from their original owners, but still connected to them in significant ways. And by the way, one last thing on that front, dumpster diving does have a number of advantages for me personally. As we were discussing earlier, my house is almost entirely outfitted with scrounged materials. Everything I'm wearing tonight, except for this jacket, hand-me-down from my brother, thank you very much. Everything else is scrounged in the dumpsters, as are almost all my clothes, all my tools, all my toiletries. So it's, again, a self-sufficient way of living. But of all the things you find, all the poignant suggestions of memory and loss and change, the most profoundly significant are, of course, the discarded photos. And as you're seeing here, hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of those that I've scrounged just not only over the past 45 years, but in the past 20 years, I've returned to Fort Worth from my travels and lived in West Fort Worth. So everything you're seeing tonight and in the book, if you take a look at the book, are photos really scrounged really from near here, from just west of here in various affluent neighborhoods. Why affluent neighborhoods? The trash is so much better quality than in poor neighborhoods. So if you want a nice shirt, you go where the nice shirts get thrown away. But that also means that certain photos get thrown away in those neighborhoods as well. So by finding thousands, perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of these photos in the past 20 years, it creates an interesting sort of hinge between collective memory and collective amnesia. Right? These photos are evidence that we as individuals, as families, and as groups are dedicated to remembering who we were, to having visual images of events that mattered to us, yet for various reasons, those images come unstuck from our lives and end up in the trash. And much like the trash itself, sometimes you can read perhaps that an older person has now left their house and gone to a nursing home. You can deduce that these are the product of a divorce, especially when you find, as I have and as we have in the book, photos torn in half where one person of the couple is there, the other person has been discarded, or perhaps the other way around. We don't know who threw away the photo, but we know something has been torn asunder. So these photos create a kind of collective archive of life on the west side of Fort Worth, or family life, or travels, but also a collective discarding of that memory and a sense of losing that collective memory also. In all of this, as I've thought about this over the 20 or 45 years, but over the last 20 years of collecting these in Fort Worth, the notion of ghosts has come to me with increasing clarity, that what I'm dealing with is a kind of encounter with and search for ghosts. Now, if we put aside supernatural considerations for a moment, not thinking about ghosts as a supernatural phenomenon, and you read some of the interesting literary work on ghostliness and apparitions and haunting, what it almost always refers to is the presence of absence. That even when someone's gone, even when a moment has passed us by, we often remember it. It seems to haunt us. It seems to stay with us. We visit our grandfather's old house and suddenly he's there again. We remember someone that we've lost touch with and they come back to us in a sense. So in that sense, ghostliness, or what we mean by a ghost, is again not necessarily a supernatural being or someone in a white sheet, but somehow absence being re-imported into the present, something that seems to be lost, now haunting us, coming back to us again. And so I'm sure you can see one implication of this. As these photos are, in a sense, ghosts, they have been discarded as material objects as people's lives have changed. But of course, the images that they communicate are ghostly as well. Most of the people we're seeing here are dead. Most of these people are long gone, and yet and perhaps their children or grandchildren decide their images should be long gone as well. But by rediscovering them, it creates a kind of ghostly sense of the return of the absent, of the return of that which might have haunted us in certain situations. And so in that sense, the photos do seem to me, to salvage these kind of photos does seem to me a kind of ghostly endeavor. It's digging up the dead in some ways, which is a dangerous and sometimes problematic endeavor. But I'm trained again as a sociologist, so I want to add another couple of ways in which these images strike me as ghostly, strike me as importing absence into the present. And one is, as you perhaps are already noticing, is the lack of ethnic diversity in these photos, the lack of breaking of gender roles, that in these old photos we can see gender. We can see how gender played out in terms of the expectations on men and women on raising children. We can see the lack of brown and black faces in photographs scrounged from the west side affluent neighborhoods of Fort Worth. We can see also, by the way, as we watch these, the difference between poverty and affluence, right? We see photos of people living close to the ground on a ranch or a farm generations ago, and we see photos of, in this case, a very odd kind of affluence, or Last Supper. And so in that sense, these photos not only show us what the past had to offer us, they show us what the past hid from us as well. Upon reviewing them, we can see the absence of diversity, the absence of inclusion, the absence of community in some ways, as much as we can see that as well. Something else, too, that's absent here, and that is that as a species, these photos remind us how attentive we are to ourselves. None of these photos are selfies. These predate selfies by many generations, but they are species selfies. That is, the vast majority of them are humans taking pictures of humans. And so we might ask ourselves in all these photos, what if the camera had turned away from the son, the daughter, the serviceman, and photographed what was behind them or around them or elsewhere? The camera, the photographer didn't think to do that because, again, our focus long before selfies was on ourselves. If by ourselves we mean our families, our kids, our loved ones, and ourselves as a species. There's a few ponies and dogs in here, but mostly these are showing us, reminding us what else we might have noticed were we not so busy noticing ourselves. Now, one more aspect of this ghostliness, and I want to quote the great philosopher John Prine. In John Prine's song Flashback Blues, he sings, "Photographs of the laughs recorded in between the bad times." And what he's saying there, of course, is that we tend to take photographs that matter, and we especially tend to like happy photographs. We don't necessarily photograph the laundry we had to do that morning before the party, or the day the car broke down. And so again, these photographs leave us not knowing much about people's lives precisely because they show us so much about celebrations, special posed moments, reunions, and that sort of thing. So this is a kind of trendy word in academia. I hesitate to use it, but if we interrogate these photos, if we question them for what they show us and don't show us, I would argue they are ghostly in part because they show us through absence as much as they show us through presence. Now, there's another aspect of ghostliness or the past coming back to us in these photos, and that is, of course, the materiality of the photos themselves. right? These photos are evidence of a period of photographic technology and photographic development that produced a photo in two senses of the word, both the image and the materiality of the image on a piece of photographic paper. And so in that sense, these photos are again residual. They are lost items from a lost period of photographic technology. Today, there's still materiality to photographs in the sense of laptops and phone screens. That's material as well. It's a very different kind of materiality than the photo itself being printed on paper such that it could be lost, scarred, scratched, torn, stained. These photos are material manifestations and residues of a particular period in photography and of what happened to those paper photographs, because that was how we reproduced and kept them. And sometimes, and this is one of the things I find most interesting, we can even see the photographic technology in the subject matter of the photograph. Traditionally, right, as my dad taught me, if you want a good photo, you put the sun behind you so it shines on the face of your subject, and you center your subject and take a photo. What that means, of course, is often your shadow is in the photo as well. So by the way, another ghostly presence, the photographer is both there and not there because the shadow is often there as in the foreground there, but also you can actually deduce what sort of photographic technology they were using. In some of those shadows, they're looking down into the viewfinder of an early camera, and you see their arms splayed like this, and others they're looking through the viewfinder ahead of a more modern camera. And so again, we can see the technology, the ghostly remnants of the photographic technology in the photographs, and we can even see it sometimes in the unintended subject matter of the photographs, which is the shadow of the photographer and the equipment itself. Before I leave this ghostly notion, the notion of bringing what's absent back into the present, I want to highlight one other aspect that I find particularly appealing and important about these photographs. I am not a trained photographer, and I'm not well educated in photographic history, but my specialty for years, and something I've tried to write about, is the history of photo documentary work. How it is that photography went out from the studio, out from the cumbersome early cameras, into the streets. So street photography and the attempt to produce photographs that were documents of people's lives as opposed to simply stage photos or fashion photos. And so in that light, some of my heroes, especially Dorothea Lange and W. Eugene Smith and Walker Evans, deeply influential on me, not only as seeing the world, but actually teaching me how to think about doing research and what it means to pay attention to people's lives. I would argue that many of the early photo documentarians were better researchers, really, than many of people in my field, and certainly better photographers. And André Cartier-Bresson, the great early pioneering street photographer, coined the notion of what it meant to be able to do that kind of documentary work out in the world, and he coined the notion of the decisive moment. And Cartier-Bresson said the decisive moment is the ability in an instant to both understand the social significance of a situation and to capture it appropriately photographically, right? So Cartier-Bresson was saying that if you're going to be on the streets, if you're going to be out in the world, not in your studio, not posing people, you have to develop an eye that can see that this moment matters, but also you have to have the photographic skills to think about depth of field and shadow and light to be able to communicate how it matters to the person who sees your photo. So you're in New York City and you see a wealthy business person stepping over a homeless person lying on the sidewalk in order to get into their limousine. I always say that's a moment that tells us a great deal about our economy, about injustice, about inequality and fairness. So the first aspect of that from Cartier-Bresson would be to realize that's not an inconsequential moment. To see a wealthy person step over the prone body of a homeless person is a moment that is revealing and matters. But now how do you photograph it, right? Do you kneel down to catch the person in the foreground and show the wealthy business person as taller? Do you try to get behind or in front, right? How do you now compose that photo? What about depth of field and shadows and where is your focus, right? So you have to have those skills as well. And if you get it right, as the great photo documentarians did, you have photos that, as we were saying earlier, take you aback. I can't believe I'm seeing that moment in social life where that is what gender means. That is inequality. That is what ethnic hatred looks like, right? That's the decisive moment. Well, back to these photos. These photos, if you think about them, are almost entirely decisive moments in the sense that the photographers sense the importance of the moment. We need to get a picture of our kid on his 10th birthday. We need to take a photo of our, as you'll see in some of these, of our dog because he's about to die and we'd like to have a record of his last months. I only get to see my grandparents once every 2 or 3 years. I want to get a photograph of them, right? So these are decisive moments in that sense, but they're not necessarily decisive moments in terms of photographic skill. So what you see then is an interesting blend. These are decisive moments emotionally. They often carry a sincere emotional intensity, but that is not necessarily communicated well through composition focus because we're not dealing in most cases with professional photographers. So it strikes me that these are fascinating amateur photos for the most part, and yet they're photos that try to get to what Cartier-Bresson suggested, but in some ways their failure makes them all the more interesting. That's the dog, by the way, after whom the book is named also, as you'll see if you leaf through the book. There's one more aspect of this as well. The great, I shouldn't prejudge. To my mind, the great photographer Robert Frank took Cartier-Bresson's notion and stood it on its head. Where Cartier-Bresson and other early street photographers were looking for that perfect moment that captures gender, captures ethnicity, captures the modern predicament, Frank, as many of you know better than I, in his brilliant book, The Americans, set out to catch, as he said, the moments in between, the moments that don't seem to matter, the moments that are out of focus, inscrutable, inexplicable. So Frank tried to imagine not equilibrium of the subject and the photo, but a disequilibrium of those moments that aren't quite right. You're not sure what to do next. In one of his famous photos, the car stopped beside the road, and the family doesn't quite seem to know whether to stop for lunch or keep traveling, right? These are non-decisive moments. These are moments of interstitiality, to use that term. They're moments in between events, in between decisions, in between people's lives. And so it strikes me also that the photos also, sometimes because of the ineptitude of the photographer, approach Frank's notion of photos that aren't quite explicable, that aren't easily explained. And some of my favorite photos of all these many thousands are photos where the parent tried to take a photo of the kid on the bicycle, but before they could snap the shutter, the bike is almost entirely out of the frame. Tried to catch the dog running across the yard, but the dog is exiting the frame as they do. And as you'll see in some of these, of course, not well focused, heads cut off, blurry images. These, I think Frank would say, are also a kind of art because they actually capture those little indistinct moments as much as those important moments like a birthday celebration or a reunion with grandma. So in that sense, I would dare to argue these photos do have an aesthetic. They have more than one aesthetic. They, in some ways, are attempts to achieve, without much technical skill, decisive moments, but they're also documents that show us the nature of everyday life, its in between spaces, its accidents, and its problems. And one more thing about that, and then I'll move on. These photos also, I would argue, are a kind of street art. For years, I wrote a book many years ago about graffiti and street art, and for years I've gone and talked about that. And recently I was invited to a street art conference in Scotland, and what they asked me to talk about were these photos. Because if you think about it, these photos are not domestic, they're not lodged in someone's household or someone's storage locker. They are floating and moving around in the streets. And so they're not visible street art, but they are first a kind of folk art, I would argue. They're people's photographic art, but they're also, weirdly enough, a kind of dislodged street art. They're part of what one might find digging a dumpster or blowing down the street, or if one was taking a load to the drop-off facility for Fort Worth for waste, you might see some of these photos. They are of the street now as much as they were originally of the household or of the family. So one more area I want to talk about. If these photos can at least be discussed in terms of art and aesthetics, could you discuss finding these photos and salvaging them, as I have, as a kind of artistic practice? My first answer is, I don't know. I'm not an artist, so I wouldn't presume to say whether this could be thought of as a kind of artistic practice. But if we were to begin to think like that, I would suggest there are three key questions we'd want to ask ourselves. And these are questions about myself, but they're also about you because you're watching these photos right now and looking at them. You are participating in the recovery of these photos. And the first question, if we're going to think about this as a kind of artistic practice, would be, what do we morally owe these photographs? Do we owe them the respect to try to understand them for what they were meant to be by the photographer? Do we owe them the attentiveness that can help us understand when someone is making a joke or capturing a decisive moment? Or can we play with them and take them humorously and even make fun of them? I find that very difficult. To be honest, early on, I was much more ready to joke about someone's bad outfit or the goofy look on their face than I am now, because the more I've lived with these photos, the more I see them as human historical documents, all the more important because they are not official historical documents. They are the documentations of people's everyday lives. And so the question again, do we owe these photos an attempt to validate what they once meant? And if so, of course, how do we find that out? How do we figure that out? I don't know. I didn't want to know what you've seen yet, but there's a photo you may have already seen of an older woman on an exercise bike with her hands up in the air. Have you seen that yet? Okay. But she's smiling and seems to be sort of goofing off, kind of making fun of herself. Well, if she is, then I feel okay laughing with her, but not at her. If, on the other hand, she was on that exercise bike and lost control for the moment and her son or daughter shot the photo, then that's really not funny, right? So it's a really interesting question to take photos whose origins you can't know and whose original intent you cannot know and try to ask yourself, what do I owe them in terms of how I interpret them and respond to them? And of course, the subtext of all that is voyeurism, right? We are enjoying these photos, I hope. That one I especially like. We're finding humor in them. We may find pathos in them, but are they ours to look at? Were they mine to scrounge to begin with? I thought of this the other day as I was thinking about this talk. Would I want my grandmother up there, a photo of her amidst all these other photos? Would you want your father or mother or grandmother or grandfather? If not, then why is it okay to look at these? I'm not sure. But that further reminds me that we owe them respect, and I would say empathy, and a kind of tenderness, not simply documents to make fun of or to laugh at people's outfits. A second question, if this is any kind of artistic practice, how do we categorize and organize these photos? As my wife Karen would point out, I have dozens or if not scores of boxes and folders full of these photos. And when I first began to find them, I started thinking about, I'll make a folder called automobiles. I'll make a folder for family shots. I'll make a photo for travel photos. I will do what I was trained to do as an ethnographer, which is to pay attention to something and watch for patterns and then document those patterns when you're studying a group. So my first impulse was to organize these photos by subject matter. But then I thought to myself, and this is where I stand now, that's inappropriate to the photos. Because while the original photo may have been of a dog or a subway car or a grandmother, they are distinctly discarded photos now. They exist and did exist as part of trash. They existed in a large trash bag, in a large dumpster mixed in with watermelon rinds and baby diapers. They are no longer what they once were. They are now discarded photos to be recovered. And as such, it seems to me, to be true to the subject matter, they don't need to be organized. And so when Gavin Fraser and I worked on the book, of course there is some juxtaposition, of course there's some choices being made, but you'll notice there's no captions, there's no obvious through line or thematic unity between the photos, because it struck me, and I think struck all of us, that the phenomenon of the discarded photo deserves its hard-earned ambiguity. It deserves not to be restructured as some kind of precise historical document, but to be appreciated for its uncertainty, its ambiguity, its unknowability. Which leads me to almost my final point, which is the third question, if this is some sort of artistic practice, would be, what in the hell do you do with all these photos after you salvage them from the trash? And one option, of course, is to just keep them. Another option would be to try to return them to their owner. But that also is fraught. I want to briefly point out two cases. In one case, I found before Fort Worth had its new trash system back in the 90s, I guess, early 2000s, when you still put bags on the curb. I found 10 or 12 bags full of a local doctor's life. His medical diploma, his wedding photos, his children's photos, his personal diaries. For reasons I don't know and can't know, his family or someone has simply bagged all that up and put it on the curb. As I was going through it, I realized this seemed to have some significance, and it seemed clear from the photos that he came from a prominent family in Hillsborough. So I contacted the Hillsborough Museum and ended up sitting in the mayor's parlor, because the mayor had us over for iced tea, Karen, if you remember, because I was returning to them a valuable trove of documents that are now displayed, as far as I know, by the Hillsborough Historical Society. So in that case, that was, I think, a very lovely ending to that scrounge. But in another case, a few years ago, I realized as I was digging through a dumpster, I was seeing the childhood photos of a friend of mine. And I was thrilled that I can save your childhood from the trash. You know, and so I called him immediately, and he said, I do not want those. I don't want to see those. Now, again, it's not our place to speculate, but just imagine what must have happened that he does not want those back adamantly. I didn't inquire further. Right? So the idea of somehow being a kind of savior who saves these photos from the waste stream and brings them back, as Terry and I were talking about earlier, maybe we don't want those photos. Maybe they were thrown away not accidentally, but for a reason. So hanging on to them seems a cumbersome prospect. Trying to return their owners, mixed at best and certainly morally ambiguous. And so, of course, one other option would be to think of them as sort of fish pulled from the waste stream to be admired for their beauty and then released back into the stream. So I could load them all up and put them back in the trash, but once you found them, that seems difficult as well. And so the last option, of course, is to display them. And so Fraser and Gavin and I have chosen in the book and here tonight, and as I've done in other books and other venues, to, with respect, with some tenderness, to try to think how they might best be displayed. And again, that would seem to be less through some sort of concrete interpretation or strict classification system than displayed as what they are, which is photos that don't all match, that aren't all in good shape, that are evidence of both what they originally were meant to be, but also of the ebb and flow of things that get discarded. And so before I take any questions you might have, and that with those questions behind us, I'll close with a couple of questions for you. The first one would be, what is going to happen to your family photos eventually? How many generations will pass? How many changes will accumulate before those family photos flutter out from your lives or the lives of your children or grandchildren and end up in the waste stream or in a dumpster or at a flea market? How long before the most precious markers of visual memory become instead markers of our ephemerality and impermanence? How long until you also encounter your last photo? Thank you. Terry, questions? Is that on the order?
You did a brilliant job. Yeah, we have time for questions, so.
Questions or comments? Yes.
I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating subject. I understand that when people put anything in a public waste receptacle, they've surrendered their ownership rights to it, certainly, and an expectation of privacy. But do you, in what you do, think about the ethics of appropriating for your use something that someone in some sense intended to go into oblivion?
Well said. Yes, I certainly do. I would say that it's a sort of dualism. On the one hand, salvaging those photos for history, I guess, or for posterity, or for their meaningfulness seems a worthy endeavor. But then again, displaying them suddenly, as you say, reappropriates them into my life for profit or for pleasure or for whatever reason. So that's where, as I say, I think the longer I've done this, the more protective I've become, and the more at least I feel driven to try to present the photos in ways that are respectful of them and preserve something of what they once were. But that still does not clearly solve the problem of the fact that, it's well said, it is trash. That doesn't mean that people would just as soon have it redisplayed. In fact, they may have, again, very intentionally not wanted it redisplayed. So I would say that's an inherent contradiction that has to be constantly thought through and addressed if we're going to deal with this kind of material at all. Yes?
Hi. So you were talking about the oops moment, the bicycle's almost out of the frame and things like that. And I started taking photos back when it was filmed, so I know that you don't always know what you're going to get until you get it back.
Right.
Now that we have digital, people delete as soon as they say something that's not perfect. What do you think we've lost or gained by that action?
Oh, that's a great question. And as you say, it's both a sort of technical question, but also a question about our lives and how we record them. If we can keep deleting digital images until we get the perfect photo, I think in many ways we end up living our lives as a Hollywood movie. We try to replicate the sense we've learned from advertising or from film or television of what gender looks like or what success looks like, and we lose what actually is going on in our lives, which again, I'm a great friend of Robert Frank, which are all those moments where you didn't quite get it right, where you didn't quite catch the child in the middle of the frame with the perfect smile. And as you say, that's also fascinating to think about that almost all these would not have been known at the time until 2 weeks later getting it back from the developer. So had these, that's a great point by the way, had these all been digital photos, we wouldn't have most of them, right? Because they wouldn't have lived up to some imaginary standard of beauty or photography. So many things worry me about the digital world. And one of them is, as you say, is that we lose the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the sort of accidental moment, and everything becomes in some ways a kind of staged performance. Yeah. Yes?
Is the digital deleted? Is it really deleted though? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that relates to the first point, which is, on a material level, these were all imagined to be deleted by those who threw them away. And that yet they weren't as gone as they thought they were. So that's a good point. A very good point. I have no idea. That's not my expertise, but I suspect following up on your question, that even when we hit delete on a digital image, it may still live somewhere else, perhaps to be recovered and perhaps used inappropriately in the future.
I'm going to fumble through what this question is, but it seems like a lot of the discarding of these images has been a choice by a removed choice. So somebody making that choice to remove from the person who took it or that whose life this was or whatever. So there's a certain comfortable distance to where you're able to say this image no longer matters in our particular family history,
Yeah.
or it's easier to get rid of this than it is to keep it. Where will this go? You know, all of that. And I'm wondering how that relates to the choice to dumpster dive in affluent neighborhoods, and how that relates to a particular move that you may then have, like close enough to make a decision about what those photographs become. That's maybe at a remove from, like, you're not dumpster diving in the poor neighborhoods or in the historically black neighborhoods or all those things. So that relationship of like comfortable connection, but a bit of distance.
Yes, yeah. And that's, I should have said that, or maybe it was obvious, but I at no time have ever set out to salvage lost photos. I set out to get the good stuff that people need, and before it gets to the landfill. So great point. So, and by the way, I think also in that sense, these have already been sort of doubly and triply curated, even though the attempt is to let them be what they are. Because, by the way, this came up, we were talking the other day with some folks. You know, given my love of early black and white documentary photography, without thinking about it, I think I'm more likely to grab photos that look like that than I am to grab 70s bad color reproductions. So in that sense, I'm already in a particular kind of neighborhood, and I'm bringing my own sensibility to it. And then there's the question of all those, what to do with them. But as you say, there's also the question maybe of privilege and affluence, which is how many images do you have to begin with, and how many can you afford to lose track of? You know, the new history, which started in the 70s and 80s, was the realization that if we simply study historical documents, we're going to mostly end up studying the affluent and the powerful, because they're the ones who can document their lives. So how many photos would an immigrant family from Syria have to throw away, 20 years after leaving Syria and settling in Fort Worth? So as you say, there's layers and layers of privilege and class, and also the meaning of what it means to rid yourself. And back to digital imagery, of course, some of these, many of these are 20 years old, but some of them may be now digitally copied. And so in that sense, you no longer need the print copy. So access to digital technology might also make it easier to get rid of some photos. Yeah.
That's what occurs to me is that we think, or my projection on this is that this existed in its moment, and then somebody decided to throw it away in this one dumpster where Jeff Ferrell found it.
Right.
But in fact, this could have traveled.
Exactly.
I mean, this isn't necessarily just from the west side of Fort Worth.
Right.
We don't know, which is an interesting thing to project on it. And I just want to thank whoever asked the question back there about the digital, about not keeping the mistakes anymore, because I was going to read to you a text from a friend, from Pat Kelly, who couldn't be here tonight. He was like, be sure and ask, because apparently that's a vernacular genre of photographs, the photograph of the blur.
Yeah.
He has a collection of those that he's particularly kind of enamored with.
Right. Yeah. Well, two things I would say, if I can remember both of them. First of all, not only may the photograph have traveled around and been bought by someone, but of course the family may well have immigrated to Texas. So some of those photos of those snowy hillsides, I doubt are Hearst. I imagine those are Illinois or Chicago. So as you're right, the photos have gotten lost now, but they may have been traveling, may have been moving before that. And the other thing I was going to say is that I apologize, I can't remember the author, but he's a photographer who's written about surrealist photography. And his argument, in a very small, simplified notion, is that if you set out to take a surreal photo, you've already lost the game, because you're trying to impose a kind of liminality on it. But it's the very photos of the blur that didn't quite catch in the frame, and why is that dog? That's a surreal photo. So in that sense, we need our mistakes, and maybe we also need lack of training in some ways. Maybe we don't want to be brilliant photographers, or at least we don't want everybody to be a brilliant photographer, or we would never have those more liminal, surreal images. Yeah. of all these, those are the ones I enjoy the most, is the kid moving across the frame, or the blur as someone exits the frame with mom saying, hang on just a minute, you know. Yeah. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. Just say it.
Having worked with many people who are trying to discard their belongings, many people end up being the custodian of a box of pictures of no one they know in it. So the history's already gone.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's 3 or 4 times removed.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting way of looking at these also.
Great point. And you know, it's funny, you might think, well, why not read the back of the photo, then you know who it is. But the back of the photo, as we were talking about, often says Billy's friend, right? Or Uncle Jim's buddy. It's like, I don't know, I barely know Uncle Jim, you know, much less his buddy. So very good point. Again, they're getting lost. They're almost kind of ghostly, even if you still have the box in your possession that came down to you from your grandparents. It's hard not to go deep on all this and start talking philosophically about, you know, the transience of our beings and the fragility of memory. I mean, all of that, I think, is at issue in the fact that these exist out there in the world as they do. I'm sorry, please.
I had also a question concerning what would it be like to have versus the 2 different types of photographs you're saying, those that are digital immediately and those which have been purposely discarded in every culture, such as the Buddhist culture or a culture that in whose eyes ancestors play a dominant role.
Oh, yeah. Great question. I don't know, but what a fascinating question to follow up on. What does it mean to take the photo to begin with? I suspect that's different. And the ease with which one would discard it, as you say, I suspect is profoundly different. Which would mean, it seems to me, if a family had enough stability to ensure this, that the photos handed down for generations would become, in a sense, more and more sacred. You'd be less and less likely to throw them away, even though you might have long lost track of who it was. Wouldn't that be a fascinating cross-cultural study? Well, of course, others have done that, but not only of photography, but of what it means to discard a photograph in different cultures. Yeah.
What about slides?
Boxes and boxes of slides. And in my garage, there's a bin of about 20 Super 8 reels that say things like Dad's birthday, 1951. And I just hadn't gotten around to buying a Super 8 projector, but you know, the slides you can sort of see. But isn't that interesting as well that the printed photograph is in some ways quite accessible, right? But anything other than that, it becomes you need a viewfinder, you need a slide projector, you need a projector. So that's interesting you asked that. Actually, among the many things I have cluttering up my life are all those forms that aren't easily seen as photographs, and so I put off trying to set up a slide projector or borrow a Super 8. But those are almost more ghostly, aren't they? Because they hide inside their frame what the actual content is. It's not easily seeable. Yeah. Yes?
I know you mentioned that you're not a photographer, but how has it changed how you capture your own life? When you do take photos, how has it changed what you put in that viewfinder, whether you choose to take the photo or not?
My honest answer is I'm an anarchist and kind of like, you know, kill your ego, all that sort of thing. So I really don't take many photos, maybe because I'm already so awash in all these. But I do think these have reminded me that, to state this again, that maybe the perfect photo is not the photo you want. Maybe it's, I think I learned this trick from a photographer friend of mine, right? You say somebody, all right, 5, 4, 3, and at 3 you snap it, right? In other words, you try to get the real face, not the posed face. So I guess these remind me to not try to make any image perfect and to revel in its imperfection, and that may be a more realistic and honest depiction of what my life is like or your life is like than the perfectly framed photograph. Yeah. And I'd say too, not to try to get too deep, but my God, if these don't remind you how short our lives are and how fragile they are, I don't know what would. You know, sic transit gloria mundi, so passes the glory of our lives. So these glorious, oh, there she is. Oh, and that one. Oh, speaking of that, look at the movement of that kid. That's just, and there's the photographer in the shadow. But they certainly remind me to appreciate the time I have. Yeah. Oh, hang on just a second, Terry. Wasn't there a hand right? Oh, please. Yes.
I was just commenting on the 2 shadows. I saw that the 2 ones extended the photographer and the child, so you had the 3 presences in the photo.
Precisely. There may be a better term, but that does strike me as a ghostly presence, a shadowy presence, yeah.
I was just curious if you had any other interesting stories about run-ins with subjects or family members of subjects during interviews.
Yes, I mean, part of my answer is that I've now, although I've dumpster dived all over the country and a little bit all over the world, for the past 21 years I've been in the same West Fort Worth neighborhood, and people finally figure out that you're not there to steal their insurance numbers and you're not going to leave a mess. And so really, to be honest, I've become part of my community. In other words, I used to be confronted much more like, what are you doing in the trash, or what are you looking for, or get out of there. Still happens to security guards, occasionally police officers, but I found that I think people in some ways trust me not to misuse their trash. I mean, many of them know that I'm trying to get it to a charity. I don't know if they're thinking about the fact that if I found a photo, I wouldn't, make fun of it or display it inappropriately. But I do feel like that the more people know you're not the milkman or the carpenter or the seamstress, you're the dumpster diver. And so I think the more you have a place in the community, the more likely it is to be a sort of shared enterprise and less conflictual. I'm trying to remember if I've ever had a case where I was pulling photos out and someone confronted me about that. I don't recall that ever happening. Terry?
I just, in some of what has been said and then looking at the photographs as they're moving by, I keep thinking about Roland Barthes' punctum and just that idea of not what was intended to be seen,
Right.
but what catches your attention. That, when it was like just two sets of legs in the back at the top of the photograph, and just kind of how interesting those were in comparison to what was staged
Right.
in the front.
I totally agree. And in that sense, I'm especially suspicious of, official photography of the powerful or the government. But even our own, again, official photography is hiding a good bit. And it's exactly those moments you drop the camera, right? Or you meant to get that and you got this. I find those to be especially appealing sort of windows that were accidentally opened, right? They really weren't meant to be opened. It wasn't meant to be a photograph of that, which makes it all the more interesting that it is.
Yeah, just the location of attention by the photographer.
Yes.
So as an amateur photographer, your attention is on the subject.
Right.
And what's happening becomes the real interest.
Photobombing, in a sense, but you're the bomber. I mean, it was no one bombed your photo. You bombed it with the thing you didn't mean to catch. Exactly. Yeah. There's something else about that. It'll come back.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was really remarkable. Gavin.
Now that you've got all these many thousands of photographs, where do you think they're going to go next?
I'm thinking second, third, and fourth editions of Last Picture. But not thematic, right? Just the next group.
I mean, as a physical object.
Yeah, I don't, it's funny, once this talk and some of this in the book got publicized, I've been getting inquiries from people on email and on Facebook, and then almost all of them are like, can you help me decide what to do with all my old photos? Like, no, I can't. And that's kind of the point of this whole thing. These people couldn't quite get it right. I have no idea. I don't have kids, and so, yeah, who would take, your kids would want these anyway, right? These aren't even family photos. So I guess there's a certain closing of the circle appeal to finally put them in a dumpster again, but but that seems tragic in some way. Yeah, I don't know. You want some of them? Other questions or comments? Did I miss anybody? Yes.
I'm going home and saving some pictures, starting tonight.
Saving.
Well, there's some that are just too valuable to me.
Right.
That may never be to anybody else, but at this very moment, they're very valuable.
Right. Yeah. And maybe deserve a re-examination, deserve to be, just like you reread a great book, you revisit your phone. When we're talking about this, I have this goofy cartoon image in my head, which would be, okay, if we're supposed to save all the photos, then if you're say a 20-year-old person, then your grandparents' photos and your parents' photos, if you're the single child, you should all save. And then if you have children, they should save all those and all the ones from their spouses. It just can't work, right? At some point, the house is going to blow up. So in some ways, it's an intractable problem of how many images we produced on paper, how much they mean to us, and therefore the difficulty of knowing what in the world to do with them as the years go by.
Well, I think too, Jeff, like early on in photography, the images were much more, there were much fewer.
Right.
Right? And they were so much more valuable. And so you're talking about like being able to delete and filter.
Yeah.
So we take like tons and
Yeah.
tons more photos now, and so maybe we're creating more waste.
Photographic waste, yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, is that, I didn't think about that, but many of these photos would be from maybe the 50s through the 70s, which would in some ways be the, not only was there post-war affluence in America, there was also post-war photographic technology that promoted, you got to take a roll of film at your kid's party. And so, as you say, we went from the occasional tintype or the occasional gallery portrait to that period, and now we're in an even more profligate period of tens of thousands of digital images can be shot and deleted. So that's a good point. These are a kind of post-war surplus, perhaps, of photographic residues. Yeah. Steve?
Yeah, and based on that's also interesting that they actually are going to become more and more rare.
Right.
As people take more and more photographs, they're all digital now.
Yeah.
So actually finding these is going to
Right.
become more scarce.
I think about that a lot. Is sometimes you can almost tell someone cleaned out grandma's house. Well, grandma now is using a digital camera.
Yeah.
So isn't that odd? So there's so many we don't know what to do with them. Maybe 50 years from now there'll be so few that they become valuable again. It's almost a sort of surplus commodity analysis of photographic technology, right? Each technology promotes and provides different kinds of products, right? These are products of a certain technology that may become more valuable the more thrown away and lost, and with digital technology replacing it.
I just wanted to get you to weigh in on there's one of the most popular ways to share photos on social media is where they are temporary, Instagram stories and things like that, where the whole point is that they're going to go away and maybe disappear very soon. How does that factor in, or what does that say about us?
Yeah, that's a good point. You know far more about that technology than I do, but I do rudimentarily know what you're saying, which is that it's guaranteed to not be there any longer, right? It's guaranteed to be ephemeral. One question, I guess, is it entirely ephemeral, or is there a residue kept somewhere in some cloud, or do you know the answer to that?
It depends on what you use. Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Yeah, but that would be interesting. The photograph not as a treasured memory, but as a momentary flirtation or display that you can afford to make precisely because you know there won't be any trace of it a minute later. Yeah.
Well, and that's like
Sorry.
an interesting way that we look at photography and these images of our lives, because these were family photos, right? And they were in albums and shared within the family.
Right.
And now our family photos are on display for public viewing.
Yeah.
At all times.
Great point, yeah. And again, maybe viewing by publics we're not even aware of, given what we think we now know about the digital technology. That's an interesting point, too, because you realize that on some of these, when it says on the back, Uncle Jim's friend, or this is your cousin Elmo, that would almost prove it was meant to be a family photo. And you had to explain to the kids, the grandkids, it wasn't obviously meant to be displayed somewhere else. Yeah, so public-private, temporality, endurance, all of that's at play, depending on different technologies used by different people. Yeah. Oh, Terry.
Okay, I just was going to say that I think your project is case in point that our fear of our images being out there by people we don't know has always been the case.
Right. Good point. Yeah, I don't think anybody would think about throwing a garbage bag of photos away that this is the same risk as I have
exactly.
Was that Phil? On any social platform, but if there's dumpster divers, there is. What, the other thing I don't know, and I'd love to know, I know a little bit. I mean, I remember there were some dumpster divers in New York, and some trash men and trash women who kept a museum of all the photos and cool things they found. But my strong guess would be most dumpster divers who are on the bottom margins don't have the spare time or the facility to be gathering photos. They're trying to survive. So that's interesting too, isn't it? Which dumpster divers are privileged enough to be able to put not only food and clothes in their backpack, but photos as well. Yeah. And by the way, we're talking about these being in albums. Some of those old photo albums, it's that heavy black paper, and I remember strapping those to my bicycle and thinking, this is taking up a lot of valuable space, but for me it was worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you. I'm just curious, are there other connections that have occurred to you between this project and ideas that have emerged through this project or through the photographs, the finding of photographs, and your other projects. Like I was interested in what you spoke about with the graffiti and street art.
Yeah.
But I know you've had these many chapters of studies in your
Yeah.
life, and I'm just curious if there are other crossovers that you can speak to.
I would say most recently for me, it was the idea in writing the book about drift, is that, again, it's not just digital technology that floats around and escapes our grasp. It's also, as someone said, right, these may have been handed down from someone, they may have gotten lost, discarded. So it seems to me that, again, not to try to coin a term, but images adrift are particularly interesting things. We try to fix in time and space this person, this moment, and yet the physical image itself can get lost and then be rediscovered or bought at a flea market or take on new meaning or used in a collage. And so I guess that would be the link I realized was that, again, someone was saying, it wasn't, it's Terry, you were saying, it's not just now that images can get out of our control and escape our intent. In a sense, that's always been possible, and these are evidence of that. Yeah. But it did also make me rethink also what is street art. I mean, if street art means art not made in galleries and not owned and possessed by any one person or group, then discarded images are at least potentially a kind of street art. There's certainly or alley art or urban art maybe as well. Yeah.
It strikes me that just this sort of digital analog conversation that's going on with these images, that these images, especially those that are indicating who's in the photograph, either on the photograph itself or on the back, there's this assurance that we'll forget. And so there's this idea
Right.
that the photograph is here to document what we will otherwise forget, especially in this like very, traumatized post-war period.
Yes.
People are documenting their families so that those things are not forgotten. And then on the digital end of it, there's this assurance that nothing will be lost.
Right. Oh,
and that
great.
you have everything preserved and you don't need to think about it. It's not a thing. So
Right.
never, so that the photograph is always in some way marked by us because we are tagged in all of these various
Right.
digital ways.
Right.
And it will never go away.
Yeah.
And so our responsibility is lessened greatly because we don't have the fear.
That's fascinating. And in a way, maybe the fear now, knowing what we keep finding out about digital platforms, is that it can't get lost. In other words, that not only it won't get lost, but that even if I delete it, it's still there. Whereas the fear, that's a great point. I was thinking about the when it says on the back, this is Uncle Billy or whatever, that you have to be careful not to assume, but that might well suggest that the taker of that photograph and the fact they put it in an album, it was intended for further generations, right? It was not only that we can look back at his birthday, but I want my kids to remember Uncle Billy. And so, as you say, the fear that you'll lose his memory or you'll lose this photo, and they're thus pasting in an album, whereas now the fear is we couldn't get lost if we wanted to. Yeah. I think I can't remember where I said this, but having hung out with and traveled a bit with train hoppers and studied them, there's a zine they put out called Let's Get Lost, and that's the point, is that it's an effort these days to get lost. You have to leave your phone, you have to try to dodge the satellites, dodge the police, whereas you might have in other generations imagined the fear of getting lost. Now the fear is we couldn't get lost if we wanted to. Yeah.
Jeff, the images you had of the commercially produced photographs with the large and the small one that brings back those memories of those great chrome cameras that were on the streets.
Oh, right. You put a quarter in it, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would stop you on the street, take a picture, and then it would spit out a numbered ticket, and you could order your picture from there. I always thought those were a wonderful piece of art.
Yes. I'd forgotten all about those. You're right. That's a particular moment, isn't it, in photographic technology, that you have not your camera available, but a camera available, but also have to trust that you will in fact receive your. Did you? I can't remember. Did you then pay for the prints?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So
you would send them a check.
With the.
Or money, and they would print off the picture. I just can't imagine the operation that it would take to keep track of those numbers.
Right. Yeah. Certainly. And that reminds me too that a whole subgenre here would be those kind of photos, and another, as we saw a few of these, of photo booths, right, where back in the day like 4 photos for $1 or something.
Yeah.
And so that presents its own kind of possibility and limitation. You all crowd in the booth together, or you're trying to.
My family would always take me to the rodeo, and there used to be a tunnel under Lancaster.
Huh.
park over where I guess the Modern is now, and then walk through this tunnel, and there was always a guy right at the mouth of the tunnel with the photograph.
Yeah.
And
So you'll have a memory of the, and also, as someone else has suggested, the scarcity of cameras, right? We would presume you don't have a camera with you, and therefore you're willing to pay, yeah. I'll date myself, but when I was a graffiti writer and writing about graffiti writers in the early 90s, if anyone could ever come up with a camera and take a photo of a mural, it was a big day. I mean, that's how recent it is that everyone has a camera in their pocket. So that's 30 years ago, and you know, most of us didn't have a camera, and it was
I'm afraid this is over 30 years.
Thank you. 35, yeah.
I have a thought about memory. There's an acting exercise that asks you to remember your first memory. And my thought is, how many of those memories really are photos?
Right. I've often thought that too, yeah. That's my suspicion as well, that my earliest memories are because later on I saw the photo of my second birthday and therefore believe myself to remember it. So, you know, that's postmodernism before postmodernism, right? I mean, that's the world of images becoming as real and influential as the thing itself. And and how would we distinguish that too would be a question.
And then I have a thought about the Avedon portraits that were at the Eamon Carter so many years ago.
Yeah.
And the Carter had invited those subjects to be present, and they brought their families, of course.
Yeah.
And I remember going and walking up the steps, and the children had taken napkins and plates and gotten food off the table and brought it out to have a little picnic on the front steps of the Eamon Carter. And it's very hard not to be judgmental. It's very hard not to say to those children, this is not an appropriate place for you to have your picnic.
Right.
So we have a tough time not being judgmental.
Right.
You know, when we see those images of people who really are having a tough time.
That's right.
Making a living.
And as Terry and I were talking about earlier, part of that problem is predated by Avedon's choice to take those photos and to choose that as his subject matter, which then brings those people into our world, if not inexorably, predictably, because of the visibility of those photos. I suppose my photographic hero, W. Eugene Smith, said, this has influenced me as a researcher, they would send him on assignment. He was notoriously bad. He was a drinker and never made a deadline, so it was partly the drinking. But they would send him on a 2-week assignment, and 6 months later, he wasn't ready to shoot the photos yet. And what he said was, I don't have the right to take a photo for the first year or two, because what would I know to photograph? Famously, once he was sent to Pittsburgh, never made his deadline, finally produced a book of photos, but after a year, he still hadn't taken any photos, because his point was, if I just walk in and start taking photos, those are my projection of my assumptions, not the thing itself. So back to Avedon, right? By making those choices, and maybe those are at least morally debatable choices, he in a sense has set a course for what those photos will become, which might be a different course than another photographer would have set.
I just had a thought about the kind of religious aspect of this, thinking of the deteriorating material, photographs, equating them kind of with the body, that our attachment to them is almost a bodily relationship.
Yes.
And the digitizing is sending them to the cloud, and that's kind of heaven. And so we choose what we want to go to heaven. But these are here, and we're stuck with them, and they keep reminding us of our mortality.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, they are embodied images, right? I mean, they're not pure image, nothing, I guess. An old friend of mine who's a philosopher, he and I used to argue, could there be a pure non-material image? I guess not, really. But anyway, but these certainly aren't. These are the body of ourselves, right? These are the physicality of our remembered images. They're not going anywhere. And right.
And I think many people don't want to see them.
Right. Yeah. And yet, much like reading a book versus reading an e-book, there is something about that album and opening it up or holding that photograph that is a sensually different experience than clicking on a screen. Yeah. Mark?
Also mentioning that cloud and being digital photograph, I feel like this photograph, they outlive their owners, so they're lucky photographs. And I always have this fear of digital photographs that they may disappear someday from your cloud and you never have access to it.
Yeah.
So I think these photographs are kind of reminding me of more printing and safe digital, not only digital, but also some real photos that can outlive you.
Yeah, that's a great point. We were saying about you can't lose them if you want to. Well, that's true as long as the technology holds up, but there could be a Russian hack and we're devoid of any digital photos. Yeah, but you're right. These are almost the ancestors of the people that photographed them, which again raises the issue. Then I really do think if we're going to look at them, we owe we owe a great deal of respect to take them for what they're meant to be and not make them into a joke. Not that anybody is, but I think that's an easy trap to fall into. Yeah.
Now that these pictures are starting to repeat, it's almost like we're now seeing old friends.
Actually, this is performance art. The doors are locked, and it's another 8 hours. You'll know every one of them by the time you leave. Yeah.
Can you continue the conversation about technology? As you commented about the technology for viewing the slides, technology for viewing our photos in the future may be totally different.
Right.
So that could be lost.
Yeah, absolutely. And think what we've done to these old images that were in the dumpster, right? We're projecting them right now with very high quality equipment. And so it creates a very different, to me, a very different experience. I've seen them for years like this, but to see them in this format is the medium is always the message. And here it is once again. Yeah.
I think we're good.
Good. Thank you.